Good morning. If you're watching this video, that means that recently you have had an opportunity to look at the introductory material for our novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and hopefully you've also been able to read at least through chapter 2. If we had been in the regular classroom, I would have taken this opportunity to stop and have us discuss a couple of interesting things that come up very early in the novel. These are key components that play a significant role in not only the development, the character development of our protagonist Okonkwo, but also in the plot development, the conflict within Okonkwo, but also the one that's coming with the arrival of the British missionaries. So I want us to look at some passages from chapter 1 and see what the author is doing in terms of introducing our protagonist to him, and the way the author uses foil character to emphasize certain characteristics about our protagonist. And then the second thing that I want us to look at very briefly is the way the author incorporates the African storytelling technique of Proverbs within his story. That can be a little bit odd and unusual for us, but there's a reason that they are such an important part of the language of the Igbo people. So let's just jump straight to it. I pulled up the actual text so we could refer to it from time to time. I would encourage you to go back and look at these passages because I think they are important enough in our understanding of the novel as a whole. The author starts with a description of his protagonist. We actually are given quite a few details about Okonkwo in the first 3 paragraphs. And for me as a reader, that's interesting because perhaps this means that the author needs me to understand this man. Like, I need to understand who Okonkwo is, what he believes, what he values, what motivates him, and how he exists in his society. I need to understand the man he is today and how he became that man. You know, what influenced him, so that we can kind of get inside his head and understand his thinking, because we need to understand him to be able to understand his reaction to some of the changes that are coming in his society and within his own life. So in the first 3 paragraphs, the author talks about the kind of man Okonkwo is, that he's very well known. He's famous because of his own personal achievements. Okay, it talks about him being a great wrestler. Sports were obviously valued in this society, and he was a strong, successful man. And it gives us a physical description of Okonkwo, that he's very large, tall man, has a severe look. Maybe he's a little bit intimidating even. And it talks about how he walks with a spring in his step, which almost gives me an uneasy feeling, like I can't trust his temperament. And then sure enough, the author tells us that he is easy to anger and maybe has a propensity towards violence. So we get a little bit of a picture of who this man is. And at the end of that 3rd paragraph, the author then tells us that Okonkwo had no patience with his own father. And then in the next 3 paragraphs, the author tells us about the father, this father who's been dead for a number of years, but continues to have a lasting impact on his son, and who his son is and who his son wants to be. Because as we continue reading, we realize the father, Unoka, is nothing like his son. That these 2 men couldn't be more different. Whereas Okonkwo was quite successful, Unoka is a failure. He's lazy, he's improvident. He doesn't really care anything about working and earning titles and being any kind of success or earning wealth for himself or his family. It talks about how all he cares about is drinking and playing his music and going to festivals. And I guess that's great to have a kind of a leisurely, carefree outlook on life. But remember, we're talking about a society that, you know, centers on subsistence farming, where their day-to-day survival kind of depends on that work ethic. And Unoka, the father, doesn't have any of that. And it's the people around him that are going to suffer the most. And that was Okonkwo. Even from a young child, Okonkwo witnesses the effects of his father's personality. Yes, he's a cheerful man. Yes, he's a gifted musician and artist. But is that going to feed your family? That was the care and concern in this particular society because of their lifestyle. And so from a young age, you see Okonkwo develop a desire to be more than what his father was. If his father was a failure, he's going to be a success. If his father was weak, he has to be strong. Okay, he has to earn his own reputation. And I think that because his father had such a poor reputation in the community, it talks about how people laughed at him and he owed money all over town. But because of that poor reputation, maybe Okonkwo feels even more driven to have to kind of live it down, to prove that he isn't like his father. I think it becomes a true fear, maybe one of his greatest fears, a fear of appearing weak because men were supposed to be strong. And so I would encourage you to go back and read those 6 paragraphs and really look at how the author is using those foil characters. Unoka is a foil for Okonkwo. They're opposites so that we can better understand who Okonkwo is. And then as the novel continues, I want you to notice how often this fear of failure or this fear of being viewed as weak comes into play with things that Okonkwo says and things that Okonkwo does and how the conflict develops. Okay, so I think it's pretty significant and you're going to notice it more than once. I also want to point out that later on in the novel, when they talk about Unoka, they use the term Agbala. Agbala technically means woman, but it has a dual meaning in this society to refer to a man who hasn't earned any titles. So if a man hasn't done anything with his life, he's a total failure, he's basically a woman. Well, okay, so that's interesting, and it shows us a little bit about the value they placed on women. But remember, it's patriarchal, it's male-centered society. But I think that use of language shows us a little bit as well. Like Okonkwo doesn't want that association for himself, and it really drives him. I would say it almost eats him up inside sometimes, and it affects his personal relationships. The father-son conflict, in addition to being a foil in this particular novel, it's also an archetypal pattern. And those archetypal patterns we know show up in literature from all around the world. And when those patterns are repeated throughout a story or an entire novel, then that pattern can actually become a motif. And so I want you to also be paying attention to that, the father-son conflict between Unoka and Okonkwo, and then future father-son conflicts that come later on in the novel. The second thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about very briefly is the author's use of Proverbs. And this is a good time to look at that because in that passage describing Okonkwo's father, it relates a story, a background story about a neighbor who comes to collect a debt from Unoka. And within that conversation, the neighbor speaks in Proverbs, talks about how he goes on for some time using these little metaphorical sayings. And I've highlighted a little piece here so that we can focus on the passage that I'm talking about. So let's talk a little bit about what Proverbs actually are. The early bird gets the worm. That's a proverb in modern day that we may have heard before. Early bird gets the worm, meaning that so literally the bird who gets there first gets to eat. So figuratively, if we're going to apply that to our human existence, it's a little bit about work ethic and not procrastinating. And if we want to be successful, you got to kind of be a go-getter, a carpe diem kind of thing. So Proverbs are sayings that speak a truth, but there's a metaphorical slant to it that might help us better understand a situation. Proverbs are often used to get people's attention and help them truly understand a truth about life, existence, something. And that's certainly one of the things that they're doing with Proverbs in Things Fall Apart. It tells us right here at the beginning of this paragraph that among the Igbo, the art of conversation is regarded very highly. These people cared deeply about language and being able to articulate ideas and be understood. And that may be one of the reasons they used Proverbs. They were also a little bit more creative way of thinking and showed a natural intelligence, which also was valued. And then to define Proverbs, we're given a proverb. Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. Okay, so palm oil was an important substance in their lives. They used it for cooking all their food, in their food, to cook their food, and for other things as well. So it made their lives easier. Maybe it even made their food tastier. So if we're looking at, a metaphor that Proverbs are like palm oil, then maybe they use Proverbs to make things easier to understand, or maybe to make things a little bit more interesting, probably a little bit of both. So you'll notice that characters will often insert a proverb into conversation when they're trying to make an important point, something about the way that they are thinking. Let's take a look at a couple. We'll just look at two. I have three popped up here, but we'll just look at the first two so we can see how these work. So these first two come up very early in the book. When the moon is shining, the cripple becomes hungry for a walk. All right, so literally, I think we get it. A cripple can't walk. And so being able to walk is something that he's naturally going to want. But maybe he wants it more when the moon is shining because it's a beautiful night and that's when he misses it the most. Or maybe based on geographical weather patterns, maybe the moon is always shining in this particular area of the world. And so maybe the cripple always wants something that he can't have. You have to kind of look at context where the proverb is actually used, but you need to go beyond the literal and kind of come up with a metaphorical figurative meaning so you can understand why that character is using the proverb in that particular instance. Let's look at one more before we quit. Since men have learned to shoot without missing, the bird has learned to fly without perching. All right, so this proverb is all about adaptation. When things in your environment change, you may have to change with it. Your survival may depend on it. Your success, maybe even your very existence, may depend on your ability to adapt to change. And that proverb right there probably becomes the most significant in the entire novel because these people are about to face some serious changes. So literally, men have become better hunters. So birds have had to learn to fly farther distances and not rest on branches quite so long, or they're going to be shot and killed. So figuratively, we apply this metaphorical saying to human existence, and we see that need to adapt, perhaps, and how dangerous it might be if we don't. I want you to really be prepared for these proverbs and take time to stop and think about them because they do enhance the meaning of the novel as a whole, especially some of the thematic ideas that will be presented as the novel goes on. As you're reading chapters 3 and 4, continue to not only look at these proverbs, but also character development. What else do we learn about Okonkwo? How is that related to what we also know about his father? What about other characters that we meet, like Okonkwo's own son and Woye? What's his relationship like with his own son? And how about this new character, this ill-fated lad, Ikamafuna, who's barely introduced at the very end of chapter 2? Who is this kid? Where does he come from? And what role does he play in this particular novel? And what about Okonkwo's relationship with other people in the community, like his peers, the other elders? He has a friend, Obierica. How does he relate to them, and what's their opinion of him, and how they see him as a strong, successful man in their society, or do they see him that way? And then finally, also, what about Okonkwo's wives? He has a number of wives. And so it's interesting to look at the relationships with his wives as well. And in part one, you see those relationships develop quite significantly. I'll be talking to you about the development of these characters over the next few days. Until then, happy reading. Try to get through at least chapter 4. See you soon.